Afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's webinar on IT risk management with 6clicks. My name's Craig Adams, and I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for 6clicks, based in London, and I'm joined today by our Senior Solutions Architect, Lloyd Cartwright. Just a few housekeeping items before we carry on with the webinar. So today's session will be recorded and will be available on our website after the fact. You'll see that there's a question panel that you are more than welcome to ask questions throughout the time period across this webinar. And we're leaving some space at the end of the Webby to kind of go through any Q&A. Any questions we don't get an opportunity to answer during the webinar, then we'll seek to answer, post it, and we'll follow up with you individually via email. Also at the end of this webinar, there'll be some feedback questions, and it really does help us as an organisation to improve our approach to these sort of events, as well as also define some other topics that might be of interest to you regarding IT risk management, security compliance, vendor risk management, so the whole digitizing your GRC program agenda. Also after this webinar, you will be sent a PDF copy of the slides we've been used, as well as kind of a link to the recording, so that, yeah, all today's discussion is captured and fully accessible after today. So we'll start. I think if you're a CISO or a head of information security, there are a number of core questions that you'll be constantly challenged by both the board, but also challenging yourself. And I tend to think of them in kind of three different areas. The first, and we will tackle this today, is our risk profile acceptable? Does it align with our overall strategic objectives as a business? Is it in line with our appetite? And can we tolerate that level of risk? I think the second thing, and the two are closely related, are we also compliant? And I think there's a very strong correlation between organizations, both risk profile and risk management program, in addition to their compliance program, whether that's focused on, I suppose, international standards, such as ISO 27001, NIST or CMMC, or alternatively local regulatory drivers around security. And as somebody based in Europe, we found it particularly apposite at the moment with the rise of a number of different regulatory drivers around cybersecurity, most notably if you're in finance around the DORA Act, and then if you have a wider preview around a critical infrastructure provider, NIS2. And if you look at some of the pillars that those particular regulations rest on, IT risk management, along with vendor risk management, and a few other areas are really core to demonstrating compliance with those regulations. And ultimately, all these things kind of wrap up into the main question that you'll be challenged with as a CISO is, are you confident as a business or an organization we're secure? So why is IT risk management such an important topic in today's environment? I think one of the biggest reasons is one of the things that keep boards and CEOs maybe not quite awake at night, but it's a really big part of their oversight function under their as they kind of govern the behaviors of our organization. This was a relatively recent feedback from the PwC Global Risk Survey that happened in 2023. The 2024 one is being published in a few months' time, and it kind of asked, how do boards believe that they're exposed as an organization, and what are the key threats they see in the next 12 months? And kind of inflation was the top one, but we're in an environment now where inflation has dropped back to a certain extent. And the second one, and probably for some of these boards, it might be the main one now going forward, is they're really, really worried about the cyber risks that these organizations face. I think what we'll see is some other ones that maybe slightly less of a worry, probably probably 2 years ago now when this survey was carried out, like kind of geopolitical conflict, which has clearly massively increased with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, as well as kind of climate change, which only seems to be accelerating. But ultimately, most boards consistently over the last 10 years have put kind of cyber risk as one of their top three concerns for any given period. I think we're also seeing kind of the rise of digital technology risks more generally, particularly with AI as another area of concern for the board, and kind of being able to think about cybersecurity risks and wider the IT risk management horizon, as well as existing profile, is really important for organizations to get their hands around. And this is one of the areas that putting a tool in like 6clicks can help. So when we say cyber risk, what do we actually mean? Well, I think it makes sense to orientate it in terms of some of the concepts. So the first is risk itself. What does risk mean? Well, the main enterprise risk management framework, ISO 31000, identifies risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So what level of uncertainty does a risk mean in terms of a business performing in line with its strategy and the outcomes it's trying to deliver? And often organizations think about not just in terms of IT and cyber risk, but also the wider enterprise risk. And there are some people that believe, and it's a view that I also accept, is actually IT and cyber risk is a subsegment of enterprise risk. And one of the things that we do as 6clicks is enable you to manage both your IT and cyber risks, but also your wider enterprise risk framework, whether that's operational risks, vendor risks, or other non-financial risks. Specifically in IT and cyber risk itself, essentially it's the management of risk associated with your information systems, and kind of supporting processes, and making sure that you understand and support and protect those information assets, so that the information that you store and manage is securely processed, stored, and transported across all your information systems. So what are the challenges that lots of organizations face, particularly the ones that haven't kind of currently been digitized? I think it's firstly around overall compliance with both your risk management framework, as well as your compliance with external regulators or external authorities. So I think particularly if you've currently got a manual process for managing risks in an Excel-based risk register, it's actually quite difficult to manage one risk to multiple controls and keep those things in line with each other and up to date, and ensuring integrity and two-way linking between both those things. I also think it's quite difficult if you take a very manual approach to be able to demonstrate your compliance with those frameworks, particularly as you're undergoing a certification process through an external auditor, and particularly in those instances where you're looking to comply with multiple frameworks. I think the second area that we tend to see lots of challenges in this space is around defining and enabling stakeholders to have ownership of their risks, as well as kind of as well as the controls that they manage. So how do you tell stakeholders what they need to do to make sure that their risks are actively managed, and then take them through a workflow that makes sense to them, so they take action at the right time, whether that's performing a risk assessment, updating a underperforming control, or ultimately being able to then tell their own stakeholders, whether that's the board or the head of department, that their risk profile is in line with their appetite. The third area we tend to see challenge is around visibility. So understanding how they actively manage and monitor their risks and controls in line with kind of the internal cadences that have been set, and ensure that actually the risks that they're managing are not siloed from the wider cyber program and everything that touches. And clearly cyber programs these days are incredibly complex, from threat management, understanding vulnerabilities, through to kind of core GRC challenges around risk management. And then finally, being able to report all this. Reporting can be very onerous, particularly if you're on Excel, and actually the ability to produce the right report for the board or the executive committee, either in a real-time manner or aggregating and summarizing data so they have a good understanding of the current IT risk profile of the business, is clearly a very important thing to do. And I particularly want to kind of dig down into that area. What does board reporting around IT and cyber risk really mean? Well, for me, I think it kind of comes into four major areas. So firstly, the ability to kind of summarize what those kind of core IT and cyber risks are facing the company, and really highlighting the ones that are particularly critical, but also those ones where maybe the risk profile of the organization has kind of changed over time. I think secondly, it's then being able to report on those in a meaningful, accessible dashboard or scorecard, and then not being able to just both highlight those really key risks, but also identify those core metrics that will address them, so you can define and understand whether your particular risk profile around a particular risk or risk category is in line with your appetite as a business and how you're performing against specific metrics. And then thirdly is clearly incidents will happen on a regular occurrence, particularly in the ever-changing threat environment that we face in the world today, and taking those incidents, also known as risk events, where the actual risk has crystallized, and being able to show the board the actual, as opposed to the hypothecated impact of that particular incident, what lessons were learned in terms of the response to that incident and addressing the root causes, and ultimately then being able to roll out the control improvements to ensure that the chance of that incident reoccurring in the future is minimized, again in line with appetite around particularly spend, as you look to maybe have to invest in kind of those control improvements, is clearly critical for the board. And it's a really challenging, I think, balance between cost versus risk, and getting that balance right in terms of some of the other challenges around resource availability, budget, and an ever-changing risk environment in which we all operate. And what does that kind of life cycle of a IT and cyber risk mean? So I tend to break it down into 5 major areas. So firstly, it's initial assessment. So identify what those potential risks are and assess them. So what's the chance of this happening, and what will the impact be on us as an organization if it does crystallize? And those risks can be embedded in a whole series of different things, whether it's specific IT processes, the risks associated with specific, particularly critical assets, and also assessing the risk associated with data or information contained within the organization or in third parties. Secondly, it's about taking that and assessing not just the actual risk itself or the gross risk or whatever you want to call it, but then also how can you kind of net down that risk and identify and improve the correct controls to mitigate it and tie that overall control into the wider kind of standards program that you have operating. Once those risks are assessed and mitigated, then how do we perform ongoing monitoring of that risk to see it's in line with appetite? And that tends to happen through control testing and performance, and maybe that is annual design testing effectiveness for kind of key controls, and then for those key controls, maybe looking at, are they operating in line with their design on maybe a more regular basis, and then collecting evidence to support those assessments. Clearly, things do sometimes going wrong, so making sure that you have in place and are properly prepared for responding to those incidents, and have plans around resilience to make sure you can kind of quickly recover, and then ultimately the end of the life cycle, make sure that you continually improve by embedding the lessons learned from any incident or lack of effectiveness in your ongoing controls testing program, or when you see KRIs that are outside of appetite, taking those lessons learned, or maybe responding to external audit or pen testing or whatever it is, to make sure you continually improve your risk profile as a business and making sure that you're minimizing the risk that you're carrying. So at that point, having set the scene, I just want to pivot over to my colleague Lloyd, who will explain what that means in terms of 6Clicks as a platform to support your IT risk management needs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Craig. That was not only really insightful, but before I get into the demonstration, I just want to mention again what Craig mentioned at the top of the call, which is we have that Q&A panel open. So if you want to put some questions in that Craig and I will come to at the end, then absolutely please feel free to do so. And I think while I get my screen up here, I think what Craig mentioned in that last slide around the sort of 5-step process, or a sort of standardized 5-step process, is a really good framework for what I can demonstrate today. So what you're looking at right now is the 6Clicks platform, and I'm going to attempt to cover risks in various detail, as well as some reporting that you can derive from having a SaaS-based platform. And then on top of that, maybe we'll cover the ability to what can we do to improve and those steps to mitigate risks. Okay, so when you jump into the 6Clicks platform, this is what you're likely to be greeted by. So you can see any open assessments, issues, and risks that are currently in flight for your organization. But to sort of hit the nail on the head with risks today, I just want to mention that it's never been easier to migrate your existing solution into a SaaS-based platform like 6Clicks. We have import templates for everything from risks assessments and treatment plans, and we also offer out-of-the-box risk libraries, which are templated out risks that come with overview information, risk domains, common causes, and potential impacts. And as well, you can template out all of your treatments for those as well. So when you're talking about, horizon scanning and things like that, you can absolutely template those things out before your expansion into wider technologies and things of that nature. Okay. Focusing on that risk register though, let's jump into a risk and we can see what makes one tick in 6Clicks. So I'll take vulnerable software as a risk. And everything above this gray line here is an out-of-the-box field that comes in the 6Clicks platform straight out of the box. So rich text description for any images and text that you might require, common causes and potential impact, a risk domain list, which is a huge list of things that can be chopped and changed down to suit the organization in question, risk ownership, which can be individuals like myself here, or we could actually put in groups of individuals as well. So we can disseminate information quickly and we can drive that accountability that Craig mentioned earlier. We also have the ability to have access members to risks as well. So those access members are anyone that's in that list. Once we get nice and specific with our role-based access control and we've set the administration section of the platform, only the individuals in that list are actually going to be able to touch and interact with this risk. And finally, we have the ability to tag risks. So tags are a consistent data element across the entire platform. So not only can I tag my risks as cyber risks, but I could also tag my incidents as cyber incidents. And I could tag specific questions in my audits and assessments as cyber related questions. So when I come to derive some meaningful reporting later on, I can consistently have that data filtered down to the specific point that's required. So in this case, it would be cyber. Everything below the gray line is just a few ideas of things we had added to our demo environment for, jumping off points, if you will. Parent-child field. So you can see I have my risk category and my subcategory for that 3-level approach to risk. I have a senior leadership sponsor. So thanks, Craig. You're on the hook for this one. And we also have application owners as well. So you can have native user fields in the platform, as well as things like extra rich text boxes for organizational context or patching notes maybe, as well as numerical fields for cost to accept. So when you're deriving those KRIs, you have that numerical validation there. On the right-hand side of the page is everywhere this risk touches in the platform. So you can see in 2 audits and assessments, it was recommended to be added to the register. And if I want to see the results of that assessment question that was answered, I can click on it and have a look. So because they answered planned to this, and it was us that answered planned, then this was added to the risk register. Okay. Craig mentioned as well, prioritization of assets based on various aspects, and we can link our assets directly to risks as well. So I can see this database server has been linked to this risk, and if I am to click on it, I'll be able to pull through any related information. So you can see I have the confidentiality, integrity, and availability here, but you can also add your own custom fields to any register in the 6Clicks platform. So I have my asset location, license number, whether it's a tangible versus intangible asset, and who owns that asset. And finally, we can see any related third parties. So I feel when we're talking about cyber-related risk, third parties either A, takes all the spotlight, or B, gets swept under the rug a little bit. So the third party in question, or the organization in question, is us right now, as you can see in the top left corner of my screen. We are mid-sized financial, and we are related to this risk. However, if this was a third-party related risk, we would be able to add any third party from our third-party register in here. Okay, and finally, we can add any link data we want. So anything from our registers module. So any business processes that I've set up, or threats, facilities, claims, etc. Okay. All risks also come with a live comments field as well. So those individuals that are on the hook for remediating this risk, the access members, risk owners, senior leadership sponsors, etc., have a live comments field. They can interact with each other in here, and this is all auditable and remains in the platform. Moving on slightly here, we have our risk assessment process. So I've set my risk assessment process up in a way that most of you will be familiar with. I have an inherent and a residual risk assessment process. If I was to click on one of these existing risk assessments, you can see here that I have set it up with the out-of-the-box methodology of likelihood and impact, deriving me a risk rating. And that risk rating also comes with some bullet point notes of things to do potentially. So that is the out-of-the-box methodology in 6Clicks. However, it's fully user configurable. So when I say that, I've actually changed my environment in this case to be I'm unable to click the impact field. The impact field is instead derived from various types of impact, and they all roll up to influence that risk rating. Okay, so as an example here, if I change my financial impact to very high, we'll see my impact will change up here as well. Okay. And you can do as many risk assessments as you want. So what we tend to see in the field at the moment is people doing inherent, planned, and residual risk assessments so that they can demonstrate to the board where we currently are, where we're going to be, and the potential costs to remediate some of those things. And the other thing I tend to see people doing at the moment is either site versus global risk assessment processes, or potentially lightweight versus full or heavyweight assessments. So in that initial inherent doing a likelihood and impact, and then for something more robust, or if it hits a certain threshold, potentially deriving something more detailed across confidentiality and integrity and availability, or financial versus brand versus infrastructure, etc. Okay. Moving on slightly, just in the interest of time, we have a controls and compliance section set up in the platform as well. So in blue, what you're seeing is your internal governance documentation. So that could be internal policies, controls, or it could be procedure documentation. And then in pink is the points of compliance. So in this case, I have SOC 2 set up here. So this risk is affecting our SOC 2 compliance. However, I could add in any of my authorities from my compliance section. So I could select one, such as ISO 27001 2022. and I can link directly to ISO 27001. Okay. In the controls, slightly different. We get an overview of the actual control itself. We can also see how this control links back to the authorities that it's helping to comply with. So in this case, in this control, it's linked back to ISO 27001, ISO 27001 2022, and 4 provisions of DORA as well. We can also see any issues that have come up with this control. So I have mine set to a 1 month band. However, if I go back a bit here, we'll click apply, we'll see some potential issues that have popped up related to this control. Okay, by clicking on any of these, we'd be taken to our issues register, and we begin to see the workflow associated with those. Moving on just slightly, we also have the ability to see any assessments that have been run against this control. So I can see that a control effectiveness assessment was done on this acceptable use policy. It was begun in May, and I can click in and I can see how it began working. So was the control deemed effective? Did the assessor provide any notes, any issues and actions associated, as well as any risks or attachments? And then finally, in our risks, we have treatment. So the treatment decision, the out-of-the-box methodology comes with reduce, retain, avoid, and transfer. However, I've set mine up just in case I need exception requests as well. The treatment status is a simple workflow. Where are we in the process? And I can actually add treatment plans in. So I've set up a treatment plan here that can be assigned out. We can assign due dates, completion dates. We can link it back to statements of our internal policies and controls, and we can link it back to provisions of those authority documents that we need to comply with as well. So again, we get that, we call it the DICE view throughout the platform. So I'm in risk, but I can feel my compliance and I can feel my internal policies and controls environment, and I can see how that data links together. Anyone that this is assigned to will be able to receive this in their My Task section of the platform, and they'll be able to workflow it through to completion. On top of all of this, the treatment plans are not just static to one risk. So I have this treatment plan associated to this risk. However, I can associate treatment plans that are already associated to other risks to this risk as well. So I can reuse work that's been previously done. And on top of that, I get a holistic picture of how that treatment plan is actually affecting multiple risks at the same time. Okay. The last piece of information I want to bring out is at the top here, we can see various aspects. So I have the current stage, which is active. And Craig mentioned that sort of multi-stage process earlier. We can actually create a completely configurable workflow in the 6Clicks platform for your risks. So if I head to the workflow section in the platform here, we can see that I have my 5-stage process all set out. But if I break down triage as an example, I can actually affect which fields in my risk I'm allowed to use during that stage. So as an example here, I have it set up so I can amend all of the overview information, but no risk assessments can happen in the triage stage. So I'm building up that clear picture before I begin assessing it. On top of that, I've made it so that risks can't be moved into the assess stage unless they have a risk category and somebody's actually willing to back them up in the senior leadership response here. Okay, excellent. And Craig also mentioned reporting requirements. So if I jump over to my other environment here, I just want to demonstrate a few different dashboards that we have set up. So this dashboard that you're looking at right now is for risk areas through a compliance questionnaire. So I've assessed this organization or assessed myself against ISO 27001, and I can pull through how many questions were answered and which questions derived high risk versus low risk responses. Okay, and then underneath is just a charted version of that across the domains of the assessment. So I've taken ISO 27001, I've answered all of the questions in the platform, and this chart has been generated automatically from the back of that. So I can see various risk ratings for each domain, and you can even click in and drill through and see where those risk areas are in that assessment. I can see the response was fully implemented, therefore it derived a very low risk. And then underneath is the actual results. So these charts are essentially the same. It just gives me a breakdown of how they differ in terms of what the actual result was versus the risk rating associated with that result. For something more robust, potentially, for a third-party related dashboard, as an example, I have the ability to break down my third parties based on the assessment questionnaires that they received, and essentially pull through a risk rating. So we can see which of our third parties are high risk. We could even pivot that against the criticality to the business or to the operations of the business. And we can see up here their sort of general risk score based on how they proceeded. We also have the ability to pull through any related controls tasks that help keep those controls, those detective and preventative controls in check. And we can see how we're responding to those controls and whether those tasks are being completed on time. Finally, and I'd be remiss if I didn't show it, everybody loves a heat map. So if I pull up a heat map here, we can see, like I mentioned, the heat map is fully configurable in the platform. So you can derive a risk matrix. You can see mine here is a little bit different than the usual. So based on appetite, I could potentially change this heat map to derive less greens, more ambers, if you will. But it's all drill throughable, and because we're a SaaS platform where reporting is concerned, you can always filter down onto the relevant results. It's live data, so if potentially Craig was working in the risk register while I'm actually reporting here, we would see that data change. We would see it all be configured. There is another point to raise as well, that all the reports that you've seen are available in the platform. However, we do have the ability to create your own custom reporting based on your own requirements. So I can take something like the risk details, advanced self-service view, and I can generate my own report by pulling in the relevant fields that I need for reporting. As an example, I want to see my risk IDs and then my risk names. And maybe I could throw in the descriptions as well. Excellent. Okay. Craig also mentioned the ability to respond to incidents, and we can respond to incidents through our projects and playbooks module. So if I hop in here and go into my projects and playbooks module, based on scenarios that happen, I'd be able to kick off a project and playbook from an existing template. And I can see here I have all my scenarios all listed out. I could say that we've had a malware incident, and the malware incident was on the 6/12. Create that malware playbook. And begin assigning out tasks. So I have all of the steps all listed out for the response to that problem. I can hop into each task and begin assigning them out. So I have an auditable log of everything was done, and it was done by the book with artifacts as attachments there. Okay. Craig, I don't know if there's anything that you thought was pertinent based on your question, based on the questions that have come in, or potentially based on what you covered in the slideshow.
No, so there are a few different questions, and maybe actually, yeah, we can either answer them verbally, or maybe we quickly show how it looks in the system. So the first one was, how do you show the reassessment risk level after implementing the mitigations? So I think that's a question of, how do we demonstrate to stakeholders what the residual risk is?
Absolutely, yeah. So we've just released the new feature. So the long and short of it was, before this feature was released, it would potentially be going in, and this is still feasible in the platform today. You could go into that risk, go into your risk assessment section, and just do a future risk assessment, or a secondary risk assessment. So you could call this potentially residual risk 2024 as opposed to 2023, something like that, and then kick off the risk assessment process in that manner. However, we have just released, or quite recently released, the ability to do risk reviews. So by going into your risk register and selecting the relevant risk, you can create a new risk review, and you can begin assigning out that risk review. So, for example, we could filter our register down to something like cyber, and then we could have a cyber risk review. And then I could begin assigning this review out to Craig Adams as an example. I can even set due dates for Craig to complete those that risk review and go through each of those risks and give it a likelihood and impact again and go through that process. So there is a couple of ways to skin the cat. However, I think using that risk reviews right now is the most astute way to go.
Okay. There's another question that's come in around, so this is quite a risk-centric approach. What about if the organization thinks through the other dimension around kind of more control-centric approach to managing risks? How does that look if you're more a control owner as opposed to a risk owner?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. If I go into my governance section, so this is where all of my internal control sets will live. So these are the documented versions of those living controls, detective and preventative. But let's just take something like my information security framework. And so this document is currently in edit mode. And just to have a quick peek at it, you can see on the right-hand side here is just the classic information, descriptions, next and previous review dates, stakeholder information, things of that nature. Whereas on the left-hand side is the controls themselves, or the statements of controls. And they're made up of most of the stuff you will recognize: ID, name, the domain they reside in, and owners. So I can assign out owners utilizing the platform here. Craig, what you mentioned, I'm the owner of a control. I maybe have a team under me. I can see here we have linked data. Let me pick a better one here. We have some linked data. So the linked data is going to be anything is in blue here is a responsibility. So they're those underlying tasks that are going to keep that control effective. So as an example here, I have governance group executive. I have a description for the task. I can set a due date. I can set who owns the task, as well as a recurrence and a time period. And these assigned members here are the people actually, the boots on the ground employees fulfilling this task, uploading evidence that the control is effective or not effective, or that the job has been done, so that you as a control owner can deem the control effective or
not. Okay. Another question was, how does the solution support kind of control testing, whether that's operational or design effectiveness?
Fantastic. Yeah, so I mentioned it in the risk section just briefly, and I'll just pull it up again just so we can see here. So we have those controls associated with our risks, and we can see that there are open assessments against those. But we have two different types of assessments in the platform. So one is called a questionnaire-based assessment. So that's perfect for things. It's a send and receive style of assessment. So it's perfect for third-party, supply chain, and also assessing large federated organizations against things like benchmarking assessments or internal compliance to any frameworks or standards. And we have tons of out-of-the-box templates for those things that we can link to in the marketplace that will be available after the call. However, we also have a method called requirements-based assessments. I like to call them clipboard assessments or interview-style assessments, because what they're going to do is actually let you start from scratch here, select your internal governance document of choice, so select the control set you need to analyze, if you will. We can select a respondent, which is going to be internal. Give it an assessment name. We'll just say this is a control effectiveness assessment. And we can create that. So what we're doing now is we're pulling up our criteria, if you will, or our control set, and we can actually decide upon the criteria that we want to mark this against. So what I tend to see people do is have a compliant versus non-compliant field. We could have that as a drop down, which is yes, no. We could maybe put some assessor notes in. And the criteria is completely up to you. You know, I have people who are doing 1 to 5 maturity scales based on CMMI as an example. It doesn't just have to be as rudimentary as compliant versus non-compliant. But essentially what you can do here is build the criteria of your choosing, template out this process for all of your internal detective and preventative controls, and then you can begin actually marking this based upon the requirements of the pieces of compliance you're focusing on. So as I go through something like information security here, I'd be able to mark it down as compliant or non-compliant, provide my assessor notes. But if I go into the requirement details, I can actually see the underlying important data that's relevant to this control. So I can see the provisions of the compliance that's related to. I can click in there and view those requirements. But on top of that, I can also see those tasks that I was mentioning before. So have these tasks been completed? Who has completed these tasks? Where are the evidence? Where's the artifacts that I need as a control owner to go through and decide whether this is compliant with those external or internal standards? And because I mentioned templating, you can also template out all of your notes and guidance as well. So if you want this to be a consistent approach, a centralized approach, you can complete this and add that notes and guidance section in, so that even though you're disseminating this task to another individual, they're still getting the Craig method or the Lloyd method. They're still going to be compliant. Okay. Does that sum it up nicely, Craig?
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. So there are a couple of other questions, but I think what we'll do is we'll draw the webinar to a close now, and then we'll reach out to answer those other questions individually. I'd like to thank everybody for their time today. And as I said, you'll be presented with a feedback form after this webinar. So any critique you can get on the information or what was demonstrated or other things you'd like to see in this webinar series coming up would be greatly appreciated. So thank you everybody for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.